Oh, old school comic book reviews. Okay, here's another topic that was kind of suggested by Juggernaut 44, and if I keep this up, I'm gonna have to like start giving him executive producer credit. But anyway, one thing he had brought up, communicating to me, was a question that was, why do you think Marvel has been so popular as far as overtaking DC in sales for well over 10 years, last 10 years or so, and I would even like expand that and think maybe well over even 20 plus years. And the thing is, I really don't have a hard and fast, simple answer to that. So I like to throw that out there to to anybody else who's like watching this or listening or whatever. Um, I know, excuse me. I know back in the day, it was a different, it was a different subject or different matter. I mean, Marvel pretty much took over DC Comics as far as sales, at least back in the 70s, and I don't think DC ever fully recovered, at least, not to the point of where they were the industry leaders. And back in those days it was really easy to see, DC Comics had been, the established company for, decades. Those characters had been around for, 30 years, Marvel Comics that pretty much got established by the 60s. And they were just very, very different companies. Marvel had their artists, DC had their artists, Marvel had their writers, DC had their writers. The editorial approach was different. What they would and wouldn't do as far as the types of comics they had out were very, very different. And at that time, Marvel seemed like the more challenging upstart company in a way. And I think one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is that, well, there's the obvious thing that, so-called Marvel superheroes were quote unquote more realistic. Of course, if you analyze it for more than, 10 or 15 minutes, you can see that Marvel comics aren't realistic at all, with everybody getting superpowers from atomic radiation and things like that, and being able to stretch their bodies in every sort of way and so on and so forth. But it did seem realistic in comparison, whereas you had, Stan Lee and Roy Thomas and, those other earlier generation of Marvel writers, trying to write the characters as if they had actual personalities, whereas over at DC, everyone pretty much talked and acted the same, And of course, the obvious thing of, all the Marvel comics superheroes lived in New York, which is a real city, as opposed to living in make believe cities like, Star City and Gotham City and Metropolis and Coast City and all that. But really, I don't think that's the whole thing. I mean, I think the personality of the characters are what caught on with people. And plus, you had that art, you had that Jack Kirby art, that John Buscema art, and some of the other artists, back in the day that kind of followed suit. Everything just seemed more dynamic and big and bombastic, and just it seemed like a really different animal. And I think that's what really attracted kids and teenagers and young people and even college students to that sort of thing. Stan Lee and the guys weren't afraid to occasionally tackle those, social issues here and there, And yeah, they did it at DC too with the Green Lantern Green Arrow comic. But at Marvel it just seemed like part and parcel of the whole world that the characters live in. And also I think a thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, but that was really there, was, through the editorial pages and through the letters pages, Stan and the early editors, really tried to make, well, first of all, the Marvel brand. They really were good at, you weren't just buying, like over at DC, just buying Superman or just buying the Flash. You were buying a Marvel comic, and then they made Marvel seem like the hip thing, the hip, cutting edge, cool thing, and then he kind of made the reader feel like they were part of that club. You're part of the hip club. You're part of what's happening. Everybody, had crazy, funny nicknames. It wasn't just Stanley and Jack Kirby. It was Stan the Man and Jack King Kirby and Rascally Roy Thomas. And excuse me. And like I said, everybody had these crazy, zany nicknames, and it made it seem like this was the funnest place on earth to be. And I think that really clicked with a lot of readers and whatnot. So I think that's why Marvel overtook DC, back in the day. Now you moving towards the 80s, excuse me. I apologize. They toned down the rhetoric a little bit, and you got guys like Jim Shooter. Matter of fact, Jim Shooter came in. He was kind of infamous for kind of like running a real tight ship and putting his foot down about what he would and would not put out in the comics, and he got mad about comics kind of being sprawling and coming in late and so on and so forth. And no, that idea is kind of wacky and a little bit too crazy and whatnot. And a lot of those earlier guys, left. But at the same time, under his reign, you had John Byrne doing the Fantastic Four, coming off the X-Men. You had Frank Miller doing his first run on Daredevil, and all kinds of other things going on. And I think they were able to keep that idea that this is the place to go for your fun, exciting superhero comics. And like I said, he also kind of had that whole kind of like, this is a hip fun club, even though you had less of it centering around all the other artists and writers. They were kind of less of the stars, and it kind of he was the big star. He was the big, proud, hard-working dad that's keeping all the crazy things at Marvel going to bring out these fun comics for you. Now, of course, decades later, I don't know what to tell you. I wasn't really a whole lot of like Marvel superheroes, back in the 90s. I do know, like everybody knows how everybody that was the top selling artist down there, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and everybody else left to form Image and blah, blah, blah. Their talent left, but their comics were still selling for whatever reason. But then again, you also have a case of where you take something like the X-Men. The X-Men, something in the late 70s, was like a B-list comic book, that gradually went from being a B-list comic to a top-selling comic. Then it's a comic that goes from just being a top-selling comic with some spin-offs to being like a franchise. I think at some point they had something like, I don't know, any given month you could have bought, 8 to 10 different comics that were somehow related to the X-Men or whatever. And that's what it became about. It became about selling the brand, and I think that's what I think a lot of it, Marvel's just going on inertia and reputation, and people are buying it because that's what they know. They've heard of Marvel. They've heard that brand name. They've heard of the X-Men and Spider-Man. And when people get into comics or they want to buy comics for their kids or whatever, that's what a lot of people do. Oh, I've seen the X-Men movies. I guess I'll buy an X-Men comic. Or, I remember the Spider-Man cartoon from the 90s. Maybe I'll get some of those things for my kids or whatever, And I think a lot of it has to do with that. I mean, it's not so much the talent anymore, and it's not the characters. You can't say the characters are hipper or cooler anymore because these characters have been around for 40 years, And I think their approach, you have artists and writers who sign exclusive contracts to one company or other, but you still have people who freelance and go back and forth, and then you have some people who are exclusive to DC for 2 or 3 years, then they get more money at Marvel, so they go over there for 3 years, then DC offers them another raise, they go back, So, and the whole approach, both of the companies are trying to go for that, slightly older audience, it's not just kids and teens. Now it's, more young adults and older collector guys, so we can push the material a little bit more as far as pushing the envelope as far as sex, violence, or whatever. But as far as why uh, the sex and violence in, say, Spider-Man sells better than the sex and violence in the Green Lantern. I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, I think it's just reputation and inertia. It's just like, Budweiser's the king of beers. In my adult life of drinking beer, I can't think of anybody who ever told me that Budweiser was their favorite beer. They drink it if that's all that was around, but Budweiser's like the best-selling beer because people know Budweiser. They've heard of it. So anyway, I'd really like to think or listen to what anybody else has to say. Leave your comments down below. I've got similar subject matter relating to DC over at my blog. Go over there, check it out. I'll leave the link down in the description block. Leave comments there and tell me what you think. Okay, once again, I got to thank you very much for listening, and you have a great day.